Just to
Yes, we
confirm.
can.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, so we can begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we come before you at this time, thanking you, Lord, for the opportunity that you give us as your people in different parts of the world to be able to congregate. Even, Lord, in the time of pandemic where much is taking place and we are unable to physically meet, we thank you for the mechanisms through which we are able to continue to meet, Lord, and study your word. I pray that your spirit may be in attendance to help us understand your word. I pray that you might open all our minds to the concepts that we're going to consider and study together. May it be of benefit in our personal studies as well as we continue on this prophetic journey towards the end of this world's history. This is a humble prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so hello again to everyone. My name is Nqobani, as I'm sure most of you already know. And I was asked some time back to share something with you today. And I've been struggling to prepare, but I guess eventually I was able to put something together. So what we'll be covering together is nothing new. It's something that has been covered by the leadership of this movement. I don't know if people can see my screen. Please confirm if you can.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to be looking at Adventism's three histories together. And sorry, I'm just trying to find how I can use this. Okay. Right. So we're going to be looking at Adventism's three histories, and this is based on ancient Israel's three histories. So I'm just going to draw out three basic reform lines. The history of ancient Israel coming out of Egypt, which was the time when they were denominated as a church and a nation. The second history is the history when they were taken into captivity in the time of the kings. And the third and final history is the history of Christ. These are the three histories that we're going to be considering together. So I'll just try and label them quickly. So you had the children of Israel taken out of Egypt in that first history. And in the second history, they were taken out of Babylon, delivered from Babylonian captivity. And in the final history, they were expecting to be delivered from Roman captivity. So this is Rome. These are the three histories in which God attempted to reform his people in order to use them. So the purpose that he had determined to set aside a covenant people or a denominated people was to have a channel through which he could communicate the principles of his kingdom and aspects of his character to the nations. This is something you'll find in the book of Genesis. In the covenant promises made to Abraham, God said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and chapter 22, among others, I'm not going to read them, but he does identify that the purpose that he was going to enter into covenant with him and his descendants was to be a blessing to all nations. So you can go and verify that in your own spare time, in your personal studies. Because of the amount of information we have to go through together, I will not go through every single reference that I have in my notes. But at least so that we just have a big picture of the purpose of ancient Israel's existence. So God intended that through them, man or nations learn about his kingdom and his character, what his intent was in the creation of human beings. But ancient Israel's role was going to be limited to preparing the nations for the first advent of Christ. There was a work to be done following that of ancient Israel, which would be accomplished by modern Israel. And modern Israel would follow the same pattern as ancient Israel. So you would have, again, 3 attempts at reform. And the purpose of the second denominated people was to prepare people for the second advent of Christ. So the first group of people, the first denominated people, were to prepare the nations for the first advent of Christ, God being revealed in the flesh, revealed in the form of a man. And then the second group of people were to prepare humanity for the second advent, for the ushering in of the eternal kingdom of God. Hopefully that's understandable for people. So I will just put dates on the first two as symbolic. It's not really a technical label for the first reform movement. I'm just putting 1844 as a general term. Hopefully people understand. And then the history of 1888, the development of Sunday laws. And then the history that we find ourselves in, the history of the 144,000. So as I said before, this is a structure that hopefully we are all familiar with. And it's not going to be anything new. But there is one particular emphasis that I would like to make in the study that we're going to have together, and that is something to do with how we read, how we approach inspiration, how we actually understand the words that we read in the Bible or in the writings of Ellen G. White. So how we read will be impacted by this particular study of ancient Israel's 3 histories and Adventism's 3 histories. So, sorry, just one moment. All right, so before ancient Israel were taken out of Egypt, they had been in captivity for some years. And during that time, they lost sight of God and of the Sabbath and of his character. There's much that they did not understand concerning God. They were impacted by the idolatry of the nations around them. So I'm just going to try and illustrate that. So ancient Israel was impacted by paganism, the paganism of the Egyptians, the Canaanites. That pagan idolatry was something that they participated in. And it shaped their worldview. It impacted how they looked at things, how they understood God, how they understood themselves, how they understood the way things were supposed to be. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if it's because of me. Can people hear that echo?
I am not hearing it.
I think it's your partner.
Yeah.
I think it's I think it's your partner isn't on mute.
Oh, okay. Hopefully she heard that. Okay. So moving on, I was saying ancient Israel was impacted by the idolatry of the nations around them, and it shaped how they viewed the world. And what God wanted to do was to not only get them out of Egypt, but to get them out of the mindset of Egypt, to get them out of this idolatrous mindset. This was the work of these 3 histories. They were 3 because he failed the first time, he failed the second time, and only succeeded the third time. And there's a rule that we use to understand such kind of a phenomenon. It's known as the rule of triple application. And in the rule of triple application, we basically say the characteristics of the first combined with the characteristics of the second will help you to understand or know the characteristics of the third history. Also, we find some things that are the same in all three histories. The characteristics of the first are equal to the characteristics of the second, which are also equal to the characteristics of the third. So it just depends on what that is. So some things are just standard across the board. They are the same. And then others are found in the first history that are not in the second history. And other things in the second history that are not in the first. But when you combine them, they help you to better understand the third. And when it comes to the issue of idolatry, idolatry was a consistent theme throughout the history of ancient Israel. You will find that in the first history, one clear example of them holding on to paganism is the golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai. When they felt abandoned by Moses and by God, and they felt threatened and desired to feel safe, they pressured Aaron to build the golden calf, what we usually refer to as the Apis bull. And that's how they understood God. Excuse me. That same mindset they continued to have beyond the time of Egypt, in Babylon, and even in the time of Rome. So, let's see. All right, so when you look at the church, the Jewish church, the church in the time of Rome, they expected the Messiah to come and deliver them politically from their political enemies. The reason they did that is because they looked at deliverance from ancient Egypt, so that it was political. They looked at deliverance from Babylon, and they saw that that was political as well. So they expected that there would be some type of political deliverance in the history of Rome, but they did not understand those histories contextually. And because of that, they made woeful mistakes. And as a result, when Christ actually came, they were not prepared to receive him. They were not able to recognize him. So the first history was a history of failure. The second history was a history of failure. But the third was success. Let me just try and note that. So that's an F for failure. Hopefully it's clear enough to see. Another F for failure. And then an S for success. So the first two histories are histories of failure. The third being a history of success. What constitutes the failure, as we've already defined, is this inability to unlearn the idolatry of the nations that surrounded them, the nations that they had integrated into, and that God was trying to take them out of. Because that idolatry was basically a misrepresentation of divinity. It was a misrepresentation of God, a misrepresentation of humanity. And God wanted to correct that. So if they were unable to unlearn those ideas about humanity and divinity, it constituted failure. So they failed in Egypt, they failed in Babylon, but there was going to be success in the time of Rome. So one of the characteristics or aspects of triple application that we need to consider in order to make a correct application of it is that the first two histories are literal and the last history is symbolic. So hopefully you understand what that means. L is for literal and S is for symbolic. So the first two histories that are past are literal histories, and you understand them literally because you want to know the context. You want to understand what actually happened in the time of Egypt and in the time of Babylon. By the time you get to Rome, many years have passed, centuries have passed, the world has changed. So you would not expect things to happen in exactly the same way as they happened in the time of the kings of Israel or in the time of the Exodus. So thus you have a literal, symbolic application. The Hebrews were not able to do that because they did not understand how to read correctly. And this is the emphasis of our study, that so that we do not repeat the mistakes of ancient Israel, we need to read correctly. We need to actually understand things in context. So when it comes to modern Israel is Adventism, and Adventism was not drawn out of pagan nations, because by the time Adventism is being called to do its work to prepare the world for the second Advent, humanity has progressed a great deal. Much of humanity is no longer literally bowing down to graven images or idols. That was now a thing of the past. It was not as widespread. Christianity had become a dominant force in both the old and the new world. So where Adventism is called out of is actually from Christianity. It's a Christian context. Adventism is called out of Protestantism. Most of the people that then made up the Millerite movement were from the United States. They were from the Protestant churches. So Protestantism would then parallel the paganism of ancient times. And this Protestant mindset, you will find, will impact Adventism from the time of its formation to the very end of time, to the time that Christ actually comes the second time. And in order for us to avoid being impacted by that mindset to our destruction, we have to be able to define it. We have to be able to name it in order to tame it. But what has happened generally is, like ancient Israel in the time of Christ, we have made a triple application of prophecy, but without due consideration of context. We have not really looked into our past to understand some things that may not be applicable today, things that are applicable today. We've been very general in our expectations of the end of the world. So, for example, we take the Advent fervor of the Millerites, the fact that they were expecting the imminent return of Christ. We take the message of righteousness by faith and the expectation of a Sunday law crisis in the late 1800s, and we use those to determine what we expect in our generation. We basically say, as Adventists, particularly conservative Adventists, that we expect a Sunday law crisis. We also expect a message on the imminence of the second Advent. And if you look at it, this is a general understanding in Adventism. But that understanding is not fit for purpose. It's very childish, to say the least, and it's unrealistic, to put it more bluntly. And the reason for that is because what we use as Adventism to explain the end of the world and the right conduct in life is a 19th century Anglo-Saxon, that's English-speaking world, Victorian worldview. So I want to read a bit on this Victorian worldview, what it encompassed. I'm not reading everything about it, but parts of it that I found interesting and probably relevant to our study today. So what I'm about to read is taken from Encyclopedia Britannica concerning the Victorian era. This is what it says. It says, today, Victorian connotes a prudish refusal to admit the existence of sex, hypocritically combined with constant discussions of sex, thinly veiled as a series of warnings. There is some truth to both sides of this stereotype. Some few educated Victorians did write a lot about sex, including pornography, medical treatises, and psychological studies, Most others never talked about sex. Respectable middle-class women in particular were proud of how little they knew about their own bodies and childbirth. In addition, Victorians lived with a sexual double standard that few ever questioned before the end of the period. According to that double standard, men wanted and needed sex, and women were free of sexual desire and submitted to sex only to please their husbands. These standards did not mesh with the reality of society that featured prostitution, venereal disease, women with sexual desires, and men and women who felt same-sex desire, but they were important nonetheless. So this is the first point concerning the Victorian stereotype. And that is, in the Victorian era, there wasn't much discussion on the subject of sex, and they were set stereotypes concerning sex and gender. So that's, I guess, a summary of it. Many people who would have been expected to know better were actually proud, particularly women, that they did not understand much concerning their own bodies. They didn't understand much concerning childbirth. There was this idea that men were more driven than women were, and women would only submit to the desires of their husbands to please them. And yet it did not, it did not go along with the reality that was in society, that there was a lot of prostitution, there were women, a lot of women with sexual desires, and there were men and women who actually felt same-sex desire. The second paragraph I'm going to read says the following. Victorian society was organized hierarchically. While race, religion, region, and occupation were all meaningful aspects of identity and status, the main organizing principle of Victorian society were gender and class. As is suggested by the sexual double standard, gender was considered to be biologically based and to be determinative of almost every aspect of an individual's potential and character. So before I continue, I actually want to start making a connection here that what the Victorians were doing is they were now conflating, they were bringing together, sort of mixing two concepts together, gender and sex. They were basically arguing, some were arguing, that gender was biologically based. Gender has more to do with behavior, while sex has more to do with physical construct. Basically how your body is structured and how it functions. And they were saying gender, which is being womanly, according to how society understands being womanly was, and being manly. They believe that these things were actually biologically based. And that's a significant thing, because if men are sexually driven, more sexually driven than women, if they're aggressive sexually and women are passive, then that's going to sort of give you a bit of insight into the different spheres that men and women fit into. So I'll continue the quote. It says, Victorian gender ideology was premised on the doctrine of separate spheres. This stated that men and women were different and meant for different things. So they would say, because our bodies are different, our behaviors will be different. Men are aggressive, women are passive. And this fostered the idea of male dominance and the idea that men and women were meant to do different things. They were meant for different spheres. Men were physically strong while women were weak. For men, sex was central, and for women, reproduction was central. So men were more concerned with pleasure, while women were more concerned about making babies. Men were independent, while women were dependent. Men belonged in the public sphere, while women belonged in the private sphere. Men were meant to participate in politics and in paid work, while women were meant to run households and raise families. Women were also thought to be naturally more religious and morally finer than men, who were distracted by sexual passions by which women supposedly were in trouble. While most working class families could not live out the doctrine of separate spheres because they could not survive on a single male wage, the ideology was influential across all classes. So this is the part of this Victorian worldview that I want to pick up, the idea of sex and gender, right? And this is because it would have a large impact on Adventism, on how Adventism would organize, on how it would develop its theology, and it would impact the writings of Ellen G. White, as we are going to see. So moving on with our study, what we're basically saying is that we cannot look at the three histories of Adventism, these three histories, 1844, 1888, and the history of the 144,000. We cannot take the two former histories and apply them as is in the history of the 144,000 because times have changed. We also have to consider that the way that Adventists viewed the world in the 19th century is radically different from how we would or should understand the world today, how humanity in general understands the world today. This Victorian worldview was not something peculiar to the Millerites. They borrowed it from Protestantism. It was a legacy issue. They took it with them from the Protestant churches that they had been a part of, from childhood. So when it comes to the history of the 144,000, we cannot claim that 19th century way of understanding things and, how we are to conduct ourselves correctly. We cannot use that worldview. We cannot claim it as something uniquely Adventist. We cannot claim it as some special insight or light that we've been given by God, because it was common, it was widespread, and it was seen on the most part as impractical, even though it had a great influence on society in general. So this worldview, the Victorian worldview, socially conservative, and it had its roots in medieval Europe in the 1260 time period. It basically sees social change as a threat, whether it's in the world or in the church, and it seeks to stifle discussion on social matters. So it's this mindset that was actually responsible for the apolitical stance of Adventism in 1844 and 1888. They did not care much about external events. And it's also responsible for Adventism's conservative positions on race, on gender, and on sexuality. This is why you'll find male headship and homophobia, for example, are sort of like official positions in the church to this very day. It's not some special light we got from God. It's actually a common way of viewing the world that was there in the 19th century. And the conservatives of today still like our forefathers. We are not encouraged to talk about social matters, just like in the Victorian age, really, there wasn't much discussion on social matters, particularly within the church. And this is why conservative Adventism in particular it demonstrates an indifference to political disputes. Whenever you see political disputes as a conservative Adventist, you are indifferent to it, you don't think it matters. There's more important issues like sanctification and salvation. We do not see any link between social matters and salvation. Conservatives argue that the politicians engaged in these disputes are all part of a satanic deep state that can't be trusted. They see political changes towards global cooperation, global integration as part of a plot to bring about a one world government that forces people to accept policies that are in opposition to their faith. And they say this will eventually lead to the enforcement of Sunday observance. They see movements for social change such as civil rights, feminism, LGBTQ equality, basically all international human rights efforts. They see that as a threat to religious integrity. They say some of these things may be genuine, when people are ill-treated in societies, that's definitely genuine cause for concern, but it has nothing to do with salvation. And this comes from that mindset that same Victorian mindset that basically discouraged people from talking about social matters. So we would not see the connection between the things that happen in society and the end of the world. We would not see the connection between these everyday interactions between human beings and salvation. It's something we still struggle with today, even in this movement. It makes it seem like, our movement has lost direction. We're now just talking about social justice, etc., etc. In order for us to understand why we feel that way, why we feel disoriented, why we feel like we've lost direction, why we feel like these things have nothing to do with our faith or our message, we have to be able to trace these things historically and prophetically. So conservative Adventism, because of this 19th century worldview, without realizing it, has created a theology that fosters hatred or at least disdain for everyone that is either outside of the church or does not share their conservative worldview. If you don't think like them, then you're not worthy of any rights or any attention. And this creed causes conservative Adventism to desire deliverance, not from sin, but deliverance from the social changes, the social dynamics of this present world, like the Millerites did. So we're going to talk a bit about the Millerites and their worldview, how it impacted their understanding of the end of the world. And we're also going to see, we're actually going to look at it from a negative perspective today, the Millerite history, the Millerite movement, the Millerite mindset, and hopefully it will help us to begin to see that the way Adventism views things is not fit for purpose. It was actually a failure to understand God's will, a failure to understand the nature of his kingdom and his character. So desiring Christ to come in order to save you or people that think like you or behave like you and then destroy everyone else is not correct, because God never intended that. That is not his character. And hopefully it will become clearer as we progress in our study. So looking at the history of, we're going to go back now. We're going to go back to the history of Moses and the history of Babylon and the history of Rome. We're going to look at some details. And then having looked at those, we will then make application to the history of the Millerites, the history of second generation Adventism, and then see how that impacts us as people who are called to be part of the 144,000. Okay, so when we talk of the history of Moses, we know that God's people were called out of Egypt, but they failed to carry out their obligation in the land of Canaan. And they particularly failed because they did not unlearn the idolatry of the pagan nations around them. So they couldn't represent the nature of the kingdom and the nature or character of the king to those very nations. That was the reason why they were called, but they were unable to do that because they were unable and unwilling to unlearn the idolatry of those pagan nations. So they thought, the Hebrews thought, that one of God's primary attributes was the spirit of conquest. They thought God was characterized by conquest and that he favored the Hebrews above everyone else and that he delighted in the destruction of pagan nations. This is what they thought. The judgments on the Egyptians and Canaanites were misinterpreted by them and strengthened them in this thinking. I mean, they would look at God plaguing the Egyptians, ravaging Egypt, destroying their crops, their animals, killing the firstborn. And that just strengthened them in the idea that, God is here to fight for us and to destroy them because he loves us and he hates them. God will destroy the Canaanites on our behalf because we are the chosen people and he loves us. They also thought that God was a male prototype. If we know what a prototype is, it's basically a device or a model which serves as, what can I say? It serves as the model for every other device that's going to follow. You know, that devices that are going to follow that same pattern. They are characterized by that first device or invention. So they thought God was the male prototype, that he represented the male species more than any other. And they thought that because he had worked with their forefathers through the patriarchal system, he had worked through male heads of the family and of society. And because after that patriarchal period, he set up a male-centered priesthood, male-centered civil leadership, and a male-centered legal system. If you look at the law of Moses, it just spoke much concerning men as priests and Levites, men as judges, and basically the law was in favor of men. You could marry and divorce at will, basically, and women didn't have too many rights. God was trying, of course, to the best of his ability, to make the environment more conducive for women. But nonetheless, the fact that society, Hebrew society, was just biased towards men, it just strengthened them in this idea that God must be male then, or he must be at least a male prototype, relating more with men than he does with women. So you see that they had a toxic form of nationalism and sexism from very early on. And what made it worse is that their mindset was codified in the writings of Moses. It was reflected in the words of his writings. Sorry, could you just give me 2 minutes? Electricity just came back, so I want to just change my positioning, and hopefully I can start using the whiteboard here at home. Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine.
Right. So,
In the meantime, I'd just like to welcome Sister Rosalind, Sister Taisha, Sister Annabelle. Welcome to our meeting.
can people see and hear me?
Yes, it's nice to put a face to the name.
Okay. Could Tabo spotlight my, is it called spotlighting? I don't know, spotlight my account. I can't even see myself. I don't know. I'm trying to position it in a way that the board can be seen at least.
Did you hear that, Tawo?
Yes.
I'm struggling to see what's on the board personally.
Sorry, I'm actually trying to fix it so that maybe it won't work. I don't know. Yeah, it looks like the lighting is not good enough. Maybe if we elevate it. Sorry. I'm really sorry, guys. Doesn't seem to be making much of a difference, is it?
That's a little better.
A little better. Okay. Okay, I'll just say what's on the board. Is that a little clearer? It's basically the same stuff that I had drawn out on the. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. We have power wars in our country. Okay, maybe we can continue. So we're speaking about the history of Israel coming out of ancient Egypt, and I was basically trying to explain that the Hebrews had this idea that God was a God of conquest. He liked to fight, and they wanted a God who would fight for them and destroy the enemies. So when they saw God plaguing the Egyptians and basically destroying their nation, they were strengthened in that mindset. When he fought the Canaanites, they were strengthened even more in that mindset. They also believed that God was a male prototype. And these ideas, these nationalistic ideas, these sexist ideas, what they did is they shaped the way they viewed the world. They shaped the way they understood how things should be. But they also got codified in the writings of Moses. Moses wrote these things into law. This nationalism, this sexism. If you look at the law of Moses, it was biased largely towards men. And this did not make things any better for generations that were to follow later on in the history of ancient Israel. So we'll read a quote from Desire of Ages, page 28. Desire of Ages, page 28 says the following. This is talking about Israel when they had left Egypt and were entering Canaan. But the Israelites fixed their hopes upon worldly greatness. From the time of their entrance to the land of Canaan, they departed from the commandments of God and followed the ways of the heathen. It was in vain that God sent them warning by his prophets. In vain they suffered the chastisement of heathen oppression. Every reformation was followed by deeper apostasy. So she's basically confirming that from right early on, ancient Israel was plagued by this desire for national greatness. They wanted to be great. They wanted all these other nations to be subservient to them. And that if they were not subservient to them, they would be destroyed. That was their mindset, essentially. And following their failure to unlearn in that reform movement, they went through a period under the judges and a period under the kings. They still didn't unlearn. then God allowed them to come under the authority of the heathen nations, which is the Babylonian captivity. So what he wanted to do in the Babylonian captivity is he wanted them to learn through pain what they had failed to learn through instruction. So this is this second history here, the history of Babylon. So we've talked about Egypt, we've now come to Babylon, and God allowed them to go into Babylon because they thought like Babylonians, they thought like pagans. They really desired to be like those nations. So God essentially gave them up to the rulership of those nations. And they got to have a very intimate experience with being ruled by idolaters. And he was hoping that by that they would understand the evils of nationalism, the evils of thinking that God is a God of war, he's a God of conquest, and that he is this male prototype. Of course, this was just the beginning of the work. It did achieve something, because when they came out of Babylon, they were essentially cured of the forms of idolatry. They were no longer bowing down to golden images and stuff like that. But they continued the mindset, which was a problem. So when God took them out of Babylon, it was another attempt at reform or unlearning paganism. And what they did this time is they took the writings of Moses and they read them in a fundamentalist or literalistic way. I don't know if that makes sense to people. They basically took the law of Moses, which had been compromised by nationalism and sexism, and they wanted to live by it to the very letter. So instead of taking them out of the pagan mindset, it reinforced that pagan mindset, if that makes sense, because the nationalism they were coming out of, the sexism that God wanted them to come out of, was only being reinforced. I'll give an example of how God was now working to break up this sexist system from right early on. Prior to the reform movement of the beginning of ancient Israel, the time period of Moses and Joshua, God's people had been in a period of darkness. They had been led by patriarchs. And these elders, these people, the eldest people in these different tribes or families, were the ones that were responsible for the social, religious, and political affairs or health of their families and their tribes. When you come to the time of Moses, what's going to happen is there's going to be a change of leadership. God is no longer going to work through the patriarchs, but he's going to start these changes very gently. He's going to do very, very few changes. Instead of the firstborn of each family being the spiritual head of the household, he's now going to establish a separate priesthood, the Levites. So God was already beginning to break up the patriarchal system. But it's very difficult to see, it's very difficult to identify, because it's a system of leadership that just moves from men to men. So if you don't look at it from the perspective of progression, you won't actually be able to see that God was already beginning to deal with the sexism that had plagued his people, in connection with the nationalism that had plagued them, just like the nations around them. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is the writings of Moses were not meant to sustain nationalism or sexism, but they were very limited in what they could convey and what they could communicate to people concerning the work that God was doing to actually get rid of those things. So when they come out of Babylon, when they eventually leave this captivity, they're just going to take those writings and they're going to try and be faithful to a plain reading of the law of Moses. They do not consider the context. They do not consider that time has progressed. So what that is going to do is, while it removes these forms of idolatry, it reinforces the mindset. It reinforces the idea that God is a God of conquest. He's got a fighting spirit. He favors Hebrews above other nations, and that he's a male prototype. And really, there's very little that God can do about that. So it's also a history of failure. They actually become more nationalistic, more exclusive than they were before. This is something that Ellen White explains in Desire of Ages, page 28, paragraph 5. I'm not going to read it. I basically summarized in my explanation what she says in Desire of Ages, page 28, paragraph 5. Now the question is, how are they going to be a blessing to the nation?
Sorry, Nqobani,
Yes?
can you write that reference in the corner there?
On the board?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, I'll write the references on the board. So the first one was DA 28.1, and then the second is DA 28.5. I tried to write it big enough for people to see, hopefully. If not, then maybe I'll take a picture at the end. Okay. So how are they going to be the blessing that God had intended them to be when he gave Abraham the promise, when they were becoming more exclusive, more introverted, more nationalistic, basically? How are they then going to reach out to those Gentiles? How are they going to reveal the character of God and the character of his kingdom? The answer, of course, is they were not going to be able to. It was a failure. And yet, what the Jews did in this time period, in the time of Rome, is they took the history of Egypt and the history of Babylon and used this to inform their expectations in this history. They said there was political deliverance, there must be political deliverance. Here, the Hebrews believed God is a God of conquest. Here, they reinforced that understanding by a plain reading of Moses' writings, which had codified an idolatrous mindset. I hope I'm clear in what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that Moses was not used by God to reveal aspects of his character. What I'm basically saying is that God was limited in how far he could go in telling that generation about himself, and in basically trying to get them out of this idea that he delights in conquest, that he delights in the destruction of pagan nations, and that he's a male prototype. Moses could not comprehend everything. So for as much as what he wrote was revolutionary for the time, it was misunderstood, misinterpreted, and even because of his own limitations, because of his inability to understand God correctly, because he was subject to the rules of his own dispensation, you find that nationalism and that sexism was codified in his writings. I mean, he refers to God in male pronouns. Even up to today, we're limited in what we can do. We don't even know how else we can refer to God. So that's just sexism in the words, really. If you don't read properly, if you don't read correctly, you're just going to interpret that to mean God is male, God is on the side of men, or God likes conquest. He plagued the Egyptians, he killed pagans. He said, I'm going to destroy the Amorites when their iniquity is full. He protected his people, but he destroyed all those people. It's quite easy to frame a nationalistic idea from the writings of Moses. So this is what I mean when I say nationalism and sexism are codified in his writings. This is not to say that he intended to put nationalism or sexism into his writings. So point being, they take those writings in the time of Babylon and they try and apply them as a thus saith the Lord, plain reading of the law in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. That just makes them more fundamentalist. It reinforces the idolatrous mindset, basically, more nationalistic. And by the time they get to Rome, they are keeping the letter of the law. They are very strict in their Sabbath observance. They are very strict in following the regulations that were given by Moses. They do not take time to reason or consider that times have changed, that the world that they live in is not the same world that Moses and ancient Israel lived in. They don't consider all of that. And they believe or they hope that by faithfulness to the letter of the Old Testament, they will be able to solicit God's favor in their behalf, and God would, as they understood, come and destroy their enemies, the Romans, and exalt them above all nations. But when Christ came, he did not come to do that. If anything, he just let the state burn. He let the state do what it does, and he focused on reforming his church. He separated, essentially, political matters from religious matters. He said the things of Caesar are dealt with in the realm of Caesar, and the things of God in the realm of God. He went around healing the sick, interacting with publicans and sinners, people that were looked down upon in Jewish society. He showed a respect for women that wasn't common in his time. So what he was doing was actually quite revolutionary, and it was unusual, it was strange, it was weird. And his people could not recognize him for the Messiah that he was. Here was God in the flesh, but they could not see him. And the reason they could not see him is because of the paganism that they had carried over from Egypt all the way to the time of Christ's first advent. So if we take that structure and apply it to Adventism, we'll find that this Protestant mindset, the Victorian worldview that we discussed earlier on, impact Adventism all the way to our history, all the way to the second advent of Christ, and informs our general expectations as Adventists concerning the end of the world. And because of that, most Adventists will not be able to recognize the events that are taking us to the close of probation, the events connected to the close of probation, that which leads us to the second advent, and they'll be found unprepared. So this is a warning to us to be able to understand this, because this was life and death for the Hebrews. It's life and death for us. Okay. So before we move on to the history of Adventism, I just want to mention a few things about Christ when he came. Christ taught in parables. He basically used the natural, considered the context, and then applied the spiritual to something different. I'm going to put it simply. And because of his teaching in parables, he was able to make clear to those that were willing to hear what the nature of his kingdom and the nature of the king was like, what the character of the king was like, which was something that he had always wanted to do. And by his parables, he wanted his disciples to understand that the Egyptian and Babylonian deliverances were misunderstood, that God actually loved Jew and Gentile the same, and that God actually loved male and female the same. The evidence of that work, the evidence of that success can be seen in the life and writings of the Apostle Paul. Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 21 and 22, that there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So he understands, he's an example of someone who understood in the days of the Apostolic Church, in the days of Rome, that actually idolatry was not a problem unique to the pagans. It was something that impacted Jew and Gentile alike. And this is what God wanted to deliver them from all this time. So that's one example. And in Galatians 3:28, he actually says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, free or bond, and there is neither male nor female. So he's beginning to identify things that are quite radical, really, things that are not usual, because for a Jew to be identified as at the same level as a Gentile was seen as an insult, and yet it wasn't meant to be an insult. It was just a statement of fact that whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, you're a human being, you do not understand the character of God, you do not understand the character of the King, and it takes the Holy Spirit, it takes parables, it takes human effort to come to a point where you begin to understand those things. But that being said, this was not a full revelation of Christ's character. It wasn't a full revelation of the nature of his kingdom, because they still maintained the idea of God as the male prototype. They, for example, did not condemn the institution of slavery. Paul did not speak against the institution. All he said is that slave masters should treat their slaves properly. They should treat their slaves nicely. That of course, would not be what we would say today. So they did not, it was not a full revelation of God's character, because God did not delight in slavery at all, in the institution itself. Neither did God delight in the submission of women. And it's funny because Paul wrote Galatians 3:28, identifying that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, and that there was neither male nor female. But the same Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 5 that wives should submit to their husband. It just demonstrates that he only understood, that the church only understood the revelation of Christ's character to a certain extent. So while this was success, it was not the end of the story. This was not the complete work of revealing who God was to humanity, at least in this present world. Another denominated people were going to need to be raised up to continue the work of explaining the nature of Christ's kingdom and the nature of his character. So you'll find that the misunderstanding or the limitations in understanding that the apostles had were also reflected in their writings. I've already given an example. Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. And he also says, wives, submit to your husbands, which is against the idea of there being neither male nor female in Christ. If there's neither male nor female, it means they're equal. And if they're equal, then there must not be submission. But they could not comprehend that at that time, and God just let it slide. He let it be. And we'll read a quote from Education to explain this phenomenon. ED, page 170, paragraph 4. Let me be checking on my time. So Education, page 170, paragraph 4. It says the following. God intends that to the earnest seeker, the truth of his word shall ever be unfolding. While the secret things belong unto the Lord our God, those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children. The idea that certain portions of the Bible cannot be understood has led to neglect of some of its most important truths. The fact needs to be emphasized and often repeated that the mysteries of the Bible are not such because God has sought to conceal truth, but because our own weakness or ignorance makes us incapable of comprehending or appropriating truth. The limitation is not in his purpose, but in our capacity. Of those very portions of Scripture often passed by as impossible to be understood, God desires us to understand as much as our minds are capable of receiving. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, that we may be thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So Ellen White explains this phenomenon that God is actually limited by our capacity to comprehend truth. So whenever we see seemingly contradictory statements, we should not read those as contradictory, But we should be able to understand that in the process of God revealing his character, whether it was in the time of Moses or in the time of the apostles, these people were human, and their capacity to understand and relay what they learn about God was also limited. So some of these misconceptions about God will find themselves in human expression. They'll find themselves in the words. But this does not take away the revelation of truth that would have taken place in that history. Just as we said in the history of Moses, that a lot was revealed about God as much as the Hebrews could bear at that time. But that did not eradicate all the misconceptions. It did not take that away from the words because of the limitation of human expression and human comprehension, human understanding. Moses understood only to a certain extent, and therefore some things would continue to be addressed at a future time as human beings are able to bear it. It's a similar situation in the time of the New Testament, that some things just continued. The male prototype continued. But they made great strides in actually understanding how God loved Jew and Gentile equally. God loved his covenant people and those that were not his covenant people the same. That was a major, it was major progress. So in the history of modern Israel, we also have three histories. We've already identified the Millerite Reform Movement, the history of 1844, the history of 1888, and then the history of the 144,000. These first two would also be histories of failure. This would be failure. Second one would be failure, but the final one would be success. And we draw this structure from the structure of ancient Israel. Excuse me. So I want to discuss the Millerites now. Excuse me. And why the Millerites were unsuccessful. So the Millerites paid no particular attention to external political events that were happening around them. They developed a theology that basically said God favored them as believers in the judgment hour message and the message of the second advent, and that everyone else was outside of that worldview.
Hello? Is it just me that's lost connection with the brother?
No, I'm not able to hear anything either.
Looks like his line is dropped. We can give him a moment to get back on.
Yeah. Welcome, Sister Janine. Nice to have you here with us this morning.
Yes, happy Sabbath, everyone. How are you?
Happy Sabbath.
What had happened? I'm not hearing the speaker.
He was having power cuts, so I think he probably has another one where he is. A visiting speaker from Africa. So he was having problems with his power line.
Uh-oh.
Hello? Can people hear me?
Yes, we hear you now.
All right, sorry about that. I think it was a network issue this time.
Yeah.
All right, so continue. What did people last hear? I don't know what you last heard, because it seems like I've been offline for a while.
No, you're just going into would speak about the Millerites line. So you didn't really go Millerites line.
Okay, so I'll just touch on that again. I basically said that the Millerites developed a theology that essentially taught that God favored them above everyone else. And that's because they believed in the judgment hour message and that they believed in the imminent second advent. So they might not have taught it this way, but this was the practical implication of what they believed. That is, anything outside of the judgment hour message, anything outside of the imminent second advent, the advent on October 22nd, 1844, was unimportant. And that if you did not believe in that message, you would be lost. So they believed that the door was forever closed on the world on October 22, 1844, that no one else would have an opportunity to be saved. So essentially, they alone were going to be saved. So we usually don't look at it that way, but that was very ugly, actually. That was very selfish, if you think about it, where they say, we, the Millerites, a small band of Christians that have studied out some message on time, are going to go to heaven, and then the rest of you have no opportunity to go to heaven. You're going to be lost. That's what they taught. And they just believe whatever else is happening, who cares? Christ is coming. Miller actually commented on a presidential election that was taking place in 1844. And he said the election is not even going to take place because by the time for the election comes, Christ would have come. So we don't need to be worrying about elections. And you see that apolitical attitude, this indifference to political matters, political discussions, this indifference to social matters. It's the Victorian mindset that I was talking about, the way that it manifested in the church is, who cares about what those people are doing out there? God just cares about us and about what we are doing and what we believe. If you don't believe what we believe, then sorry for you, you're not going to be saved. So Christ didn't come, of course, on October 22, and the door was not forever closed on the world. And they felt bitter disappointment. And after that disappointment, they didn't become any better. They were more concerned with self-vindication than they were about following on to understand the mercy of God in ushering in a new dispensation. And because of pride and unwillingness to continue interacting with the world, they desperately wanted God to conquer and destroy their theological enemies and prove them correct by taking them to heaven. So I'll just put a quote. We'll read this quote. This is from Great Controversy, 403, paragraph 3. This is just to show the mindset of some of the Millerites in general after the disappointment of October 22nd, 1844. So Great Controversy, page 403, paragraph 3 says, a feeling of awe, a fear that the message might be true, had for a time served as a restraint upon the unbelieving world. After the passing of the time, this did not at once disappear. At first, they dared not triumph over the disappointed ones. But as no tokens of God's wrath were seen, they recovered from their fears and resumed their reproach and ridicule. A large class who had professed to believe in the Lord's soon coming renounced their faith. Some who had been very confident were so deeply wounded in their pride that they felt like fleeing from the world. Like Jonah, they complained of God and chose death rather than life. Those who had based their faith upon the opinions of others and not upon the word of God were now as ready again to change their views. The scoffers won the weak and cowardly to their ranks, and all these united in declaring that there could be no more fears or expectations now. The time had passed, the Lord had not come, and the world might remain the same for thousands of years. So the Millerites were more concerned, again, about their pride They felt that their pride was wounded. God had not vindicated them. They complained of God. Some of them wanted to die. They wanted to flee the world. So their desire to be saved had nothing to do with an appreciation of God's character. What it really had to do with was, this belief that I am special to God, and those that do not behave or think like I do are not. They are deserving of destruction. So it's basically the same thing as ancient Israel, if you look at it. Israelites thought, God favors the Hebrews more than the pagans. He fights on our behalf. He conquers our enemies and destroys them and delivers us. But that was a misunderstanding of God. It was a misunderstanding of his character. So in the same way, the Millerites were indulging in the same mindset, only in a different context. This was not physical war. It was spiritual war. It was religious war. They were more concerned with proving themselves correct. They were desperate for God to actually prove them as correct by destroying their enemies and taking them to heaven. So they just wanted to end life on earth. They were tired of dealing with the social dynamics of this present world. And they didn't care, really, if you look at it, they didn't care about the sufferings of people around them. The 1844 election, if you are to study it, we don't have time to study it, but if you are to look at the 1844 election, you'll find that two central issues were slavery and American expansion. And American expansion was going to involve the massacre of Native Indians. So the Native populations were suffering, Black people were suffering, and that was not of sufficient importance to the Millerites, to receive any kind of religious attention. They did not think it was their sphere. They did not think really it was their place. What they were concerned about was ensuring that on October 22, 1844, they had their prediction correct, that God came to save them. Who cares about the slaves? Who cares about the Native Indians? It was quite toxic when you really start thinking about it that way. They had a wrong view of God. It was a form of religious nationalism. And with such a mindset, they were not going to be able to warn the United States of the sin of slavery and the judgments of God that were to come upon the nation. So as a result, in the 1850s, they began to backtrack on their message. They were more focused on self-preservation, temporal prosperity. Members in the church held on to different theological views, and it brought them to a point where, as a corporate body, they rejected the 2520. If you look at the reason why they rejected the 2520, they were basically saying, there is no thus saith the Lord for the 2520. But the question is, where was the thus saith the Lord for a definite time for the second advent? Where was the thus saith the Lord for October 22, 1844? Those things were all applications. So they were now being inconsistent, and they were going back to Protestant thinking. The Protestants had rejected the Millerite message on the grounds that there was no precedent set. Well, at least to them, they could not see a plain thus saith the Lord that said on October 22, 1844, Christ is going to come. So they quoted verses, no man knoweth the day nor the hour. They quoted thus saith the Lord, if I can say that, a plain reading of the scriptures, without due consideration of context, in order to nullify what the Millerites were saying. Now the Millerites were using the same techniques, the same methods of reading to backtrack on their own theology. And I believe one of the reasons why they were doing that is because they wanted to remain relevant. They wanted to prove their message and mission to be correct, to be valid. And in order to do that in a Protestant world, you have to give your biblical evidences. You have to give your thus saith the Lord. You can't be telling us about structures. You can't be telling us about applications? Who gave you the authority to make those applications? Where is your proof for this? Where is your verse for this? So they were becoming more and more like the Protestants again. It was a failure. Hopefully we can see that. From 1844 to 1863, they were really unfit to carry the message to the world. So I see that our time is almost up, and I probably won't be able to finish my notes, which is okay. But I want to be able.
Sorry, brother, we had allocated half an hour for question and answer. So if there isn't much, you still can go over 15, 20 minutes if you want to. I have one question, but I don't know about anybody else. Where you can go over the 1 o'clock if you need to.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. All right, so the next point that I want to bring out is this. The Millerites had religious nationalism. We've tried to explain in not so much detail, just in general terms, how this nationalism manifested within their movement, where they thought that God favored them, loved them more than the churches around them. Excuse me. But in doing that, they shared the same mindset as the very churches that they were coming out of, that also believed that God was on their side, that God favored them above everyone else, and that their way of thinking, their worldview was superior to everyone else's. But also, the Millerites held on, just like ancient Israel and the Protestants, to God as the male prototype. This idea continued from ancient Israel into modern Israel. And how this male prototype manifested is in the church's male-oriented organization. You had male elders and male ministers, while you had women, acting as teachers, lay workers, if I can call them that. The people that had officially recognized religious positions in the church were men. So you have this male-oriented organization, but it also was reflected in the way that Adventist theology developed. So Adventist men wrote very specific details on political matters after 1844 in connection with their prophetic discourses. So when they would talk about, say, the post-1844 history, they spoke about political personalities, they spoke much about the details of the laws that were actually being debated in Congress in the mid-19th century. But this was not seen as anything that was acceptable for a woman. Remember, we read earlier on when we defined the Victorian mindset that there was this idea that sex and gender were conflated, they were almost the same thing, and it meant that men and women were different and were built for different spheres. Men for the public sphere, women for the private sphere. The role of women was to take care of the household and raise families. And men would participate in political matters and political discussion. So this was reflected in the Adventist church as well. You'll find that the Adventist men, whether it's James White, Jane Andrews, and even later personalities such as A.T. Jones, would talk about specifics concerning things that happen in politics and connect that to the end-time prophetic narrative. But for women, generally, that just did not happen. And this in turn impacted the ministry of Ellen G. White. She herself believed that the role of a woman, her primary role, was to take care of the household, to raise families. She taught it, she believed it, she wrote about it. And it impacted her writings concerning the end of the world. You'll find that when she speaks about the end of the world, she does not give us a lot of detail. Whether it's this reform movement here, the first one of 1844, And the issue of slavery, I'll just note it here. The history of slavery, or the history of Sunday laws. She speaks in vague terms, more or less. She speaks a lot in vague terms when she talks about the subject of slavery, how it was developing, how it was becoming a crisis in this history. When it comes to the Sunday laws, she does the same. So really, in order for you to have a proper appreciation of what was going on in that history and how we should expect the end of the world to be, you need more information than the writings of Ellen G. White. So this is now coming to the issue of how we actually read, how we approach her writings, how we approach the writings of the Bible. The Jews failed to understand how to approach the writings of Moses. And for that reason, they became very fundamentalist and reinforced this idolatrous mindset. And this carried over to the history of Rome, where most of them just failed to recognize Christ when he came. They were unable to unlearn the idolatry that they had learned, and they were lost in the end. So how we actually read the Bible, and especially for us, how we read Ellen G. White, is of utmost importance, because if we do not understand that, we will find ourselves in this, falling into the same trap that ancient Israel fell into. So she was subject to the rules of her own dispensation, like every other prophet. She was hindered by her own sexism from speaking more on political matters in greater detail, and also from supporting the movements for the rights of women, as an example. But that being said, her writings are still valuable to us, and they provide insight into much that would have been obscure concerning Bible history and end-time Bible prophecy. We still need her writings, but her writings need a teacher. They need explanation because of the dynamics involved with the development of inspiration. God gives ideas, he gives light, he gives information, but he gives it as much as humanity is able to bear in a particular history or dispensation. And certain peculiarities, or, you know, if I can call them unconscious biases, certain unconscious biases impact the writings of the prophets. They impacted the writings of Moses, and therefore, if you're going to read the writings of Moses, you have to be aware of those unconscious biases if you are not to make a mistake and sustain things that are erroneous, that do not reflect God's character. So because of that limitation that human beings, you know, can't escape their unconscious biases, this will also be reflected in the writings of Ellen G. White. She was not even conscious of the fact that this was a problematic issue. This issue of God being a male prototype, the issue of gender roles, you know, women having a subordinate role in society. Not only was it not factual, because if you look at the Victorian mindset or idea, people in that day and age could actually see that this is not practical. We can't live by these ideas. So even then, people could begin to see that this is not practical. But nonetheless, it had an influence. It impacted how people viewed the world, how people viewed people, how they treated them, how they represented things in their literature. So it would also impact the writings of inspiration, the writings of Ellen G. White. And this is something we must note in order to correct the failures of the Millerites. Coming to the history of 1888, which is our final history, before we conclude. The Lord designed that the loud cry of the dead angel's message be given, that people be warned, concerning religious nationalism, to come out of Babylon, basically. So I'm saying Babylon and religious nationalism are the same thing. It's this idolatrous mindset. So God wanted Adventism to call people out, but in order for them to call people out, they themselves had to be out of it. We've already shown how they were in it in the 1844 history. So there's no way they were going to call people out of it in the 1888 history unless they themselves had learned their lesson and came out of it. Structurally, we already see that it was doomed to fail. Really, it was a failure. They were not going to unlearn that religious nationalism. If anything, it was going to be reinforced in their experience. That history is beyond the scope of this presentation to look at in detail. But following the failures of the Millerite movement and the organization of the Adventist Church, they were engaged in increasing conflict. Adventism was engaged in increasing conflict with Protestantism. And as Adventism would urge the necessity of keeping all the commandments of God, including the seventh-day Sabbath, to those around them, Protestants would react and respond by arguing that the Sabbath was a Jewish institution and that by Adventists keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, they were Judaizing and they were legalists. So this pressured Adventists into debate, basically. And a debate is a fight. And I'm going to suggest that the spirit of debating, of wanting to prove oneself or proving your side at the expense of another, is the same as the fighting spirit of the Apis bull. It's the same mindset, it's the same idea. Because what they started doing is they started taking verses to try and show that they had the better arguments, that Adventism had the better arguments. And they wanted to make it clear to Protestants that the Bible was on their side. So they would take those verses without due consideration of context and basically suggest that this verse proves that the seventh-day Sabbath should be kept. This verse proves. They were taking "thus saith the Lord" to try and sustain their position. So they were becoming more and more fundamentalist in their understanding of inspiration. They were basically using the proof text method, where they would use proof texts to sustain their position because they believed God was on their side and he was not on the Protestant side. Basically, that God takes sides, which was the same problem that the Protestants had because they thought God was on their side during the 1888 time period. And for that reason, they wanted to amend the Constitution to make it Christian so that they could have some legal justification for having Sunday laws, for having oaths, like religious oaths to office, so that they could sustain blasphemy laws, so that they could sustain the teaching of Protestantism in public schools, right? They believed that God was on their side. So Adventism was basically reflecting the same mindset as Protestantism, even though they felt or thought that they were opposing Protestantism. And this brings us to the 1888 history. By the time we get to 1888, there's a significant general conference that happens in the church. And what that conference is doing is challenging long-established theories and basically demonstrating that Adventism's theology was flawed. It was not perfect, it was not free of error, if I can put it that way, that there were things that needed to be reconciled, things that needed to be understood by interpreting and reading the scriptures correctly. They had to be intellectually honest, if I can say it that way. They had to acknowledge that there were some things, for example, in the Ten Commandments, that were no longer fit for purpose. The Ten Commandments had slavery encoded into them. Slavery was not acceptable by the time you get to the 1888 history. And those were some of the things that they had to deal with, that the Ten Commandments were worded, they were framed in a language for a society, that was archaic, that was ancient. And they're living in the 19th century, things have changed. How are they going to sustain the Sabbath while also acknowledging that times have changed, the world has changed, and therefore some things are applicable, others are not applicable? They were not willing to even venture into that discussion concerning the law of God, because they felt that to enter into that discussion would overthrow the idea of the perpetuity of the law of God altogether. So this is my summary of the theological conflict of 1888. It had much to do with how they read inspiration, if I can put it that way. And because of how the Adventist leadership was reading, this "thus saith the Lord," plain reading of the scriptures, gives us better arguments. It proves our position. It shows that God is on our side, that he favors us, and all those sinners have to join us. The debating spirit, the fighting spirit, it rendered them unfit. It rendered them ill-prepared to actually give the loud cry of the third angel to the world. If they could not understand that they, like the Protestants, had the same religious nationalism, they had the same problem. Like in the days of Christ, Jew and Gentile, they were all steeped in nationalistic idolatry. If Adventists could not see that in this history of Sunday laws, they could not give the message. They did not see the need for a correction of their theology, therefore they could not progress. And because they failed to progress, then the Sunday laws of that history could not culminate in the end time prophetic narrative or scenario that Ellen White was laying out. Because they failed to progress in their theology, they failed to progress in their understanding of the law of God and of righteousness, of salvation, then they were not able to give the loud cry. And since they were not able to give the loud cry, there was no point really in connecting the Sunday laws that were happening in that history with the end time prophetic scenario. They had failed. And this is something that we should also consider when we read Ellen White's testimony concerning Sunday laws, concerning the Mark of the Beast crisis within this history. She writes a lot about Sunday, the Mark of the Beast. She writes a lot about how the final crisis would have to do with Sunday and Sabbath. And these are things that can quite easily be misinterpreted to develop a theological model about the end of the world in our history. That's just not going to happen. That's just not realistic. But if we understand the failures of 1888 in this context, we will be able to start seeing that really when we approach Ellen White's writings on the subject of Sunday laws, we have to approach them as a parable, because what Adventism was meant to do at that time actually failed. We have to consider that it was going to be that way, it was going to be a success had Adventism accepted the message, which was going to then swell into the loud cry. So we'll summarize and we'll close. We have looked at the three histories of Adventism with particular focus on the first two. And in order to consider these three histories, we have gone back to ancient Israel. And in ancient Israel, you see three major attempts by God to have them unlearn the idolatry of paganism and learn about his character, learn about the nature of his kingdom and the nature of the king. The first history was a failure. The second history was a failure. The final history was a success.
Brother.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Could you repeat your summary? Sorry. Please. Thank you.
Okay. What I'm saying is We've looked at the three histories of Adventism with a particular emphasis on the first two. And we have derived the characteristics of these three histories of Adventism or modern Israel from ancient Israel. We identified three major attempts by God to reform his people, to educate them on his character and have them unlearn the pagan idolatry that was around them. That pagan idolatry was nationalistic, it was sexist. It taught that God's primary attribute was this fighting spirit, that he favored a select group of people above everyone else. That's nationalism. But also that, you know, if you're going to put it in idolatrous terms, that he was the god of fertility, that he was a male prototype. The Hebrews believed the same thing. They believed God's primary attribute was the fighting spirit, so when he would come to Egypt, he would come and fight the Egyptians on their behalf. He favored them, not the pagans. So he would destroy the pagans and bless them. That's what they believed. They also believed that he represented men more than women. He was a male prototype, this idea of fertility, the idea of gender. That if you were to associate strength with anything, with a gender, you would associate it with the male sex and the male gender. Gender being a social construct, of course. So they failed to unlearn those ideas about God. And because of unconscious bias, those ideas were codified in the writings of Moses. So God was able to reveal certain aspects of himself in this history. Most of them didn't understand. Moses wrote those revelations about God in his writings, but because of his unconscious biases, he did it in a language that demonstrated that he did not properly understand God. He still unconsciously sustained nationalistic ideas about God and sexist ideas about God. When you come to the history of Babylon, God tries again. And what they do, because of the pain of captivity, is they adhere faithfully to the writings of Moses. But because the writings of Moses unconsciously had codified in them nationalism and sexism, they became more nationalistic, more sexist. So they removed the forms. They were no longer worshipping graven images, physical images, but they continued the idolatrous mindset, such that when Christ came, they could not recognize him. Those that did recognize him did so because they accepted Christ's parables. And what parables basically do is they make you aware of your unconscious biases and call you to come out of them, if I can put it that way. So Adventism underwent the same experience, but not under pagan idolatry, under Protestantism. And Protestantism in the United States was shaped largely by, you know, British society, this Anglo-Saxon, Victorian way of viewing the world, of understanding things. Socially conservative, avoids discussion on social matters, particularly on sex and sexuality, believes that the major defining factors of identity and status are gender, and that gender was biologically based. Therefore, it taught that men and women were different and were built naturally for different spheres. Men were independent, women were dependent. Men were aggressive, women were passive. Men were built for the public sphere, women for the private sphere. This impacted Adventism. It impacted them in their organization. They just sustained a male-centered organization. It impacted their theology. They actually believed that God favored them more than the other churches, and they were desperate to prove themselves correct. So they would then use debating techniques, if I can call proof texting a debating technique, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to take a verse or a series of verses to try and prove that God is on your side. So it's this fighting spirit. When Christ didn't come on October 1844, they were so desperate to have him come. They started backtracking in their theology. They started developing divergent views. And they came to a point where they rejected the 2520 because they were saying, there is no thus saith the Lord for the 2520. This will further alienate us, make us irrelevant. We want to remain relevant. We want to show or prove to these other churches that God is on our side. We cannot do it with a concept that's not there in the scriptures. We need to use scriptures because Protestants were all about sola scriptura. So this same mindset, the mindset of nationalism and the mindset of sexism, impacted Ellen White's writings. So you'll find that in Ellen White's writings, she would not speak much about political matters. She would not enter into the details of it because of the belief that women were not built for the public sphere. She had this, I guess it was more than an unconscious bias. She actually believed this thing, and it impacted her writings. And that's something that Adventism was meant to consider in interpreting her writings concerning the end of the world and what we are to expect at the end. We get to the 1888 history, and Adventism, instead of correcting their religious nationalism, become even more nationalistic because as they have engaged in conflict increasingly with Protestantism, they have used the proof text method, they've used this debating technique more and more of trying to find biblical arguments to prove their side, to the point that they started being called the people of the book, that they use Bible verses so much to prove their position. That sounds like a positive thing, but really, if you look at it from a prophetic perspective, a prophetic lens, it was quite negative. They were becoming more nationalistic. They were isolating themselves from the world and from reality because they were using a 2,000-year-old document to try and define, how things were supposed to be in the 19th century. So that was a far cry from reality. Just like the Hebrews after Babylon became exclusive, they isolated themselves from the world. By this way of interpreting inspiration, Adventism was isolating itself from the world and from reality. They just thought, look, keep the Sabbath and be saved. If you don't keep the Sabbath, you'll be lost. The Bible's on our side. And it's these two histories and this same mindset that has informed Adventism today. This is why we are always so desperate for a proof text, for a thus saith the Lord, for a quotation that sustains a certain principle or idea. And when the truth is presented to us in parables, we struggle with it. We don't recognize it. We fight with it. And that's because of the idolatry of Protestantism that has impacted Adventism throughout its history. If we are to not repeat the mistakes of ancient Israel in the time of Christ, or the failures of our forefathers, we are to correct how we read. We are to understand the idolatry of Protestantism, the religious nationalism, the dangers of the plain reading approach, or this thus saith the Lord approach, and also be able to point out some of the problems or biases that you will find encoded in inspiration, whether it's the Bible or spirit of prophecy. This is the only way we will be able to participate in the success of this movement, to be able to accept the development of truth that is continually unfolding. This is the way we will be able to reconcile this movement's emphasis and focus on social matters in connection with the end time prophetic narrative. So we'll end our study here. This is what I had to share with you. Maybe to end the study, we'll just pray together, and then I'll hand over back to the Jamaican ministry. So let's kneel together and pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the time that you've given us to study together concerning, Lord, how we read inspiration. I pray that you might help us to see the dangers, Lord, of a literalistic, plain reading of the scriptures without due consideration of context. Help us to understand, Lord, that you are limited in the amount of truth that you can reveal to your people, and that the servants that you use are also subject to the rules of their dispensation. They are subject to their humanity. They cannot escape their biases. They cannot escape, Lord, their human nature. And this reflects in their language, in the words. Therefore, Lord, we are not to place an emphasis on the words, but we are to understand things by using the method of parables, to break down the natural and understand it in its own right, and then be able to determine what's applicable and what's not in the spiritual. I pray that you might help us to see how central this is to the success of the movement that we are a part of today. And also that we may be able to recognize your character and the nature of your kingdom. I pray that you might continue to be with the Jamaican brethren in the Sabbath day as they continue. May you bless them, Lord, and even for the programs that are going to follow, may you please be with them as well. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Nqobani.